After annexing Austria and Czechoslovakia, Hitler decided to invade Poland. England and France intervened, and in the summer of 1940, he succeeded in invading France. The conflict between the Germans and the British continued until the Nazi leader decided to invade the Soviet Union when he learned that the United States might enter the conflict. However, he postponed the invasion to support his ally, Mussolini. Now we will continue our series on World War II. Who was engaged in fierce battles with the British in the African desert. This was painful for Hitler, who didn't want to waste time. He sent his best German general of the war, the Desert Fox Erwin Rommel, to lead the Afrika Korps in support of the Italian army. Hitler gave the order to invade the Soviet Union, but he was forced to postpone the invasion again because Mussolini wanted to control Greece. However, the Greeks were able to repel the attack with the help of British and Australian forces. Hitler wanted to save his ally Mussolini and secure the south before invading the Soviet Union. Therefore, Operation Marietta was launched on April 6, 1941. To attack Greece, it was necessary to conquer Yugoslavia first. Athens fell on April 27, 1941, and Hitler thus secured his position. On the southern front, Joseph Stalin received numerous reports warning of an imminent German attack on Russian territory, but he did not believe that Hitler had intentions to invade the Soviet Union. Therefore, raw materials continued to be sent to Germany, and everything seemed normal. At dawn on June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa began. The Soviet Union launched an invasion with approximately 4 million soldiers, 600,000 vehicles, a similar number of horses, and 2,700 aircraft, making it the largest invasion in history. These forces were divided into 3 main groups. The first, the Northern Group, was tasked with attacking Leningrad, the cradle of the Communist Revolution. The Central Group was responsible for attacking Moscow, and the third, the Southern Group, was tasked with attacking Ukraine, where the 4 needed resources. The attack was swift and surprise. On the first day, the Soviet Air Force was decimated, with hundreds of aircraft shot down, and others destroyed on the ground. However, the Germans were surprised by the T-34 tank, which proved superior to the Panzer tank. The German army was equipped with modern equipment and was well trained. The Germans advanced deep into Russian territory, capturing millions of Soviet soldiers and carrying out brutal executions. On July 3, 1941, Stalin addressed the Russian people, announcing the brutal German attack and the dire situation. Militarily, there was a real danger looming over the nation. Similar to what the Russians did to Napoleon, they followed a scorched earth policy, burning crops, villages, and everything that the invaders could use. The Soviet Union was vast, and supply lines were difficult and long, and would later become impossible with the arrival of the harsh Russian winter. At the Berezina River, fierce battles raged between the Germans and the Soviets. Russian rocket launchers inflicted enormous damage on the German army, but the Nazis continued their advance towards Moscow. Hitler engaged in intense discussions with his generals. Some generals wanted to continue the advance towards Moscow to capture the communist capital, but Hitler preferred to concentrate his forces in the south to secure oil and grain. Therefore, Hitler ordered the withdrawal of a large part of the Central Group to reinforce the southern forces. Stalin ordered his soldiers to fight to the last man, but with the Germans changing tactics, the Russian army in Ukraine became completely encircled. Around 600,000 Russian soldiers were captured in this battle alone. Strangely, the Germans showed no mercy towards the Soviet soldiers in Ukraine. The Germans were presented by Ukrainians as liberators and saviors, providing them with food and drink. However, Hitler misused this ally, mistreating the Ukrainians and forcing them into service in the Nazi army, a grave sin. The siege of Leningrad intensified, and the city was completely destroyed. Yet it held out. As for Moscow, the Germans were advancing relentlessly, seemingly unstoppable, but the autumn rains slowed their progress. By winter, disaster struck. The winter of 1941 and the years that followed were among the worst winters in Russian history. Barbarossa's plan was to conquer Russia within 4 months, before the onset of winter. This was a turning point in the war. The German forces in Africa, led by Erwin Rommel, were suffering from shortages of supplies and provisions. While the Germans were advancing towards Moscow, Joseph Stalin ordered the celebration of the anniversary of the Communist Revolution as usual. On November 7, 1941, the Russians held a military parade to mark the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. This was strange. The enemy was at the gates, yet the Russians were holding a huge military parade to commemorate the revolution. Joseph Stalin delivered a rousing speech to the masses, and appointed General Zhukov as commander of the battle to defend the communist capital. Good news reached Zhukov. The Japanese would not attack the Soviet Union, because they were directing all their forces towards their war with the United States. Therefore, General Zhukov ordered the mobilization of forces from the Siberian divisions. The German army, well trained for the Winter War, suffered a crushing defeat on December 5, 1941, when the Russians launched a fierce counterattack that forced them to retreat. Hitler blamed his generals, dismissing dozens from the army, most notably the commander-in-chief of the German ground forces, General Walter von Brauchitsch. He ordered the construction of a headquarters on the Eastern Front to personally oversee operations. Japan, which relied on neighboring countries for resources and had occupied and plundered most of its neighbors, was heavily dependent on American oil. However, the United States imposed sanctions on Japan due to its brutal aggression against East Asian nations and its control of numerous islands in the Pacific Ocean. Therefore, the United States stopped supplying Japan with oil. Japan's position was difficult as it had very limited reserves, so it planned to deliver a devastating blow to the United States. On December 7, 1941, the infamous attack on Pearl Harbor took place. At dawn, Japanese aircraft attacked the harbor. The attack was brutal and violent, but American losses amounted to 2,400 dead and 2,000 wounded. Several warships were destroyed. However, several questions remain. This base housed 3 massive aircraft carriers, none of which were present during the attack. They were sailing far out at sea. Was this a coincidence, a calculated move, or did the Americans have prior knowledge of the attack? No one knows. But if the Japanese had managed to destroy those carriers, it would have been a devastating blow to the United States. Furthermore, the fuel depots were not destroyed. It is true that Japan wanted a swift and decisive attack, but if the Japanese had succeeded in destroying the aircraft carriers, fuel depots, and the naval pier, they could have crippled the United States for a much longer period and changed the entire course of the war. In any case, there was no escaping war. The neutrality agreement ended, and the United States entered the war. The following morning, President Roosevelt announced the war on Japan then erupted, with Hitler and Mussolini declaring war on the United States. The entire world erupted in flames. The Secretary of State tried to persuade Hitler not to declare war on the United States, but to no avail. Hitler wanted Japan's assistance in his war against the United States. Japan then attacked American bases and British colonies in East Asia and the Pacific. Japan had managed to establish itself as a major military power, possessing 10 aircraft carriers and thousands of advanced aircraft, the most famous being the Zero aircraft. In addition to millions of soldiers who were trained for complete loyalty to the emperor, the Japanese committed widespread massacres in the countries they occupied, especially China. Churchill and Roosevelt were now in the same boat. The moment the British Prime Minister had long awaited had arrived. However, Japan continued to strike at the Allies. General Yamashita managed to capture Singapore, the jewel of the British colonies, which had been thought to be impregnable. In May 1942, the Philippines fell to the Japanese, and General Douglas MacArthur fled to Australia for fear of capture. But one of the most horrific war crimes committed by the Japanese was the Bataan March. After the surrender of American and Filipino forces in 1942 on the Bataan Peninsula in the Philippines, approximately 75,000 prisoners were forced to march 100 kilometers in the scorching sun with little water or food. Along the way, the prisoners were humiliated and treated brutally, and anyone who fell was immediately executed. Estimates suggest that between 6,000 and 10,000 prisoners perished on the march. The Allies agreed to subdue Germany through bombing, and all major German cities, especially cities which contained military factories, were bombed. The attacks on German cities resulted in heavy civilian casualties and widespread destruction of infrastructure. However, the Führer would not stop there. The Germans retaliated with V-2 rockets, the first ballistic missiles in history. Hundreds of these rockets were launched from the German coast towards Belgium and England in late 1944, but it was too late. The French were forming resistance units that carried out sabotage operations in response to the German invasion, but Hitler issued a strict order. Anyone showing the slightest resistance should be killed. Charles de Gaulle was leading the Free French forces, who fought alongside the Allies. German submarines roamed the seas, sinking any American or British ship they could find. They succeeded in destroying many vessels, especially those carrying supplies to Britain. The United States had a large number of Americans of Japanese descent, whose loyalty was questioned, and their property was confiscated. On April the 18th, 1942, the United States launched a daring attack on Japanese territory when one of its aircraft carriers approached. As far as possible, B-25 Mitchell bombers, American heavy bombers, took off from the Japanese coast and bombed Tokyo and some other Japanese cities. This strike was not very effective on Japan, but the United States wanted to show Japan that it was capable of retaliating. Some American pilots were captured and tried in Japan. In retaliation, the Japanese leadership decided to seize some military bases in the east. On June 4, 1942, Japan attacked the Midway base in the Pacific Ocean with a massive fleet led by Admiral Yamato. However, the Americans detected the attack through intelligence and code breaking. The Japanese inflicted heavy losses on the Americans, but in the second wave, the Americans destroyed 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, a devastating blow to Japan. The Japanese then attacked New Guinea. Australia felt threatened, and Japan wanted to secure its bases near Australia. A fierce confrontation ensued between American and Australian forces against the numerically superior Japanese forces. Japan managed to control parts of northern New Guinea, but its forces were unable to advance further into the country due to the rugged terrain. Japan's advance was very slow. This battle paved the way for another battle in 1942, the Battle of Kokoda, which lasted from July to November of the same year. From August 7, 1942, to February 9, 1943, battles took place. A fierce battle ensued between the United States and its allies against Japan, as Japan sought to establish an air base on Guadalcanal Island to sever American supply lines to Australia. The United States launched a surprise landing on the island in August 1942. After 6 months of intense fighting, the United States captured the island. However, one of the negative consequences of the battle was the spread of disease among soldiers on both sides. On November 9, 1942, Hitler ordered the capture of Stalingrad. He wanted to control the oil fields and the city's status as a major industrial center. Its fall would mean the end of the war on the Eastern Front. Despite objections from many generals, Hitler issued his orders to attack on August 12, 1940. Churchill visited Moscow, where Stalin was furious. Stalin wanted to open a new front against Hitler from the west to relieve pressure on the Eastern Front. Despite Stalin's anger, Winston Churchill managed to persuade him to postpone opening a new front against Hitler from the west. The Germans launched heavy air raids on Stalingrad, destroying several important factories and devastating the city. The Germans controlled most of the city, reaching the Volga River. The fighting resembled street battles. Optimism prevailed, and Hitler claimed victory at Stalingrad. However, despite this success, the worst was yet to come. Supplies continued to reach the Red Army across the Volga, even though the Germans controlled most of the city. Although the Allies were reluctant to open a new front against Hitler in the West, Britain and the United States continued to supply the Soviets with more provisions and weapons. Churchill visited British troops in the Egyptian desert, seeking to boost morale. The Battle of El Alamein was crucial. The Germans could not be allowed to control the Suez Canal. General Montgomery commanded the British forces at El Alamein. He was a skilled and confident commander, but not adventurous. German anti-tank weapons inflicted heavy losses on his forces. Despite the victories achieved by the Afrika Korps, the situation deteriorated later as the German army suffered from shortages of supplies and provisions, Allied air superiority, and numerical superiority. Rommel urged a troop withdrawal to preserve them, but Hitler refused, wanting to fight to the last man. After the surrender of France, a number of French generals and commanders were captured and imprisoned. The remaining French were divided into two groups. The first, known as the Free French Forces, led by Charles de Gaulle, fought alongside the Allies. The second joined the Vichy government, a German puppet regime. This government was later dissolved after the liberation of France from the Nazis, and its members were tried for high treason. Most French in Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia joined the Allies, preferring to fight alongside the British and Americans against the Nazis. In November 1942, Rommel decided to withdraw to Tunisia due to dwindling supplies, Allied air superiority, and his fear that the situation would worsen. Encircled from the east and west, the Allies landed in Morocco and Algeria in Operation Torch. Returning to the Eastern Front in Europe, on November 19, 1942, the Russians launched a counter-offensive to expel the Germans from Stalingrad. The plan was to encircle the German Sixth Army, whose flanks were weak, consisting of Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian units with inferior equipment and capabilities compared to the Russians. The Russians did not attack the city center directly. Instead, the Red Army attacked the flanks first, successfully encircling the Sixth Army. There was no other option. The air support promised by Göring never arrived, and all rescue attempts failed. Finally, the Sixth Army surrendered under the command of Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, who had been granted this rank by Hitler just days before the surrender as an incentive. Nazi military tradition dictated that no high-ranking general should be taken prisoner, even if it meant committing suicide. But Paulus broke this rule among more than 200,000 soldiers. Only a third of them returned to Germany after the war ended.